Please be seated. Assembly has resumed its sitting. That's good.
Committee motion number 5 of 2017-18, appointment of select committee to oversee the performance of the office of the Ombudsman, to be moved by the Honorable Deputy Governor, ex officio member responsible for the portfolio of the civil service.
Honorable Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I beg to move government motion number 5, appointment of a select committee to oversee the performance of the office of the Ombudsman. Mr. Speaker, the motion reads as follows. Whereas by Section 3 of the Ombudsman Law 2017, the Office of the Ombudsman was established to perform the functions specified under that law, as well as functions under the Whistleblower Protection Law 2015, the Freedom of Information Law 2015, the Police Complaints by the Public Law 2017, and the Complaints Maladministration Law 2014 revision. And whereas the offices of the Complaints Commissioner and the Freedom of Information Commissioner were abolished by the Ombudsman Law 2017, the Freedom of Information Law 2015 revision, and the Complaints Maladministration Law 2014 revision. And whereas Section 45 of the Public Management and Finance Law 2017 revision states that the Ombudsman shall be accountable to the Legislative Assembly for the performance of the office of the Ombudsman, and whereas Section 6.3 of the Ombudsman Law 2017 provides that for the purpose of establishing the budget of the office of the Ombudsman, the Ombudsman shall report and be accountable for expenditure to the Oversight Committee of the Legislative Assembly. Be it now resolved, therefore, resolved that the Legislative Assembly appoint a select committee to be responsible for overseeing the performance of the office of the Ombudsman. And be it further resolved that the committee shall comprise of 5 elected members. And be it further resolved that the quorum for the committee shall be 3 members of the committee, including the chairman and the deputy chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The question is, be it now therefore resolved that the Legislative Assembly appoint a select committee to be responsible for overseeing the performance of the office of the Ombudsman, and be it further resolved that the committee shall comprise 5 elected members, and be it further resolved that the quorum for the committee shall be 3 members of the committee, including the chairman or the deputy chairman. Does the mover wish to?
Yes.
The Honorable Deputy Governor.
Yeah, Mr. Speaker, just briefly to say that the purpose of this motion is necessitated because we have now created the office of the Ombudsman, as the motion states, and the previous committees that were established by this Honorable House back in May 2017 are no longer valid because they reflected the offices that have now been discontinued. So it's absolutely important now that a new committee is established so that the office of the Ombudsman can now properly function and be held accountable by members of the Parliament. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable, the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, as the Honorable Deputy Governor has outlined, the effect of the Ombudsman law is to have repealed and replaced the previous pieces of legislation, including the Complaints Commissioner law, and with it, the Oversight Committee, which previously existed. And so, Mr. Speaker, following consultation with the Honourable Leader of the Opposition, I propose that a new committee, the Ombudsman Oversight Committee, be comprised of the Honorable Tara A. Rivers, the Minister for Financial Services, as chairperson, Councillor Barbara E. Connolly, the member for Georgetown South, as deputy chairperson, Councillor David C. White, the member for Georgetown West, as a member, the Honorable Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Alva Saku, member for Newlands, and Councillor Captain A. Eugene Ebanks, the member for West Bay Central, as a member.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member for Georgetown Central?
Mr. Speaker, forgive me. I think I have to give contribution, but I'm just concerned that the balance of the committee is overloaded with government. I don't see why it couldn't have been an easy 3-2. But I know I have no control over that decision, and just thought it would have been a better balance of what the people of the country would have wanted.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, does the mover wish to exercise his right of reply?
Mr. Speaker, just to thank all members for their support. Thank you.
The question is, be it now therefore resolved that the Legislative Assembly appoint a select committee to be responsible for overseeing the performance of the office of the Ombudsman, and be it further resolved that the committee shall comprise 5 elected members, and be it further resolved that the quorum for the committee shall be 3 members of the committee, including the chairman or the deputy chairman. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. Government motion number 5 is duly passed. Appointment of the committee. It's
Okay. Yes, sir. May you have it?
I think it's agreed who the members of the committee are. Honorable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Out of an abundance of caution, I propose to move a formal motion for the appointment of the committee, the Ombudsman Oversight Committee. I move, Mr. Speaker, that the Honourable Tara A. Rivers, Minister for Financial Services, be appointed as chairperson, Councillor Barbara E. Connolly, the member for Georgetown South, as deputy chairperson, Councillor David C. White, member for Georgetown West, as a member, Councillor Captain Eugene Ebanks, the member for West Bay Central, as a member, and the Honourable Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Alva Suku, the member for Newlands, as a member.
The question is that the committee, as suggested, is chairperson, the Honourable Minister of Financial Services, the deputy chair, the member for Georgetown South, members, David, the member for Georgetown West, the member for West Bay Central, and the member for Newlands. All in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it. The committee would consist the Honourable Minister of Financial Services, Chair, the member for Georgetown South as deputy. Members would be the member for Georgetown West, the member for West Bay Central, and the member from Newlands. All in favor? Those against? I think I put that already. I've done that already, but I'm going to continue at this point. All in favor? Aye. Those against? The ayes have it.
Other business, private member motions. Private member motion number 9 of 2017-18, government security, to be moved by the elected member from Bordentown West.
The member from Bordentown West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Private member motion number 9, 2017-2018, with regards to government security. Whereas security requirements have changed in many countries around the world after 9/11, and whereas the governments in many countries require nationals of their countries to secure various ports of entries, and whereas the qualification in many of these countries require extensive background checks, and whereas the best people with the best interest in protecting our people are Caymanians, be it therefore resolved that the government considers employing only Caymanians to provide static security services at all government, statutory and public buildings before December 31, 2018.
The question is, be therefore resolved that the government considers employing only Caymanians to provide static security services at all government, statutory and public buildings before December 31st, 2018. As a member which The member from Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second this motion.
Does the member wish to speak thereto?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, thank you. Mr. Speaker, I think the motion itself is pretty straightforward, but from my own travel experience, Mr. Speaker, I've always wondered why is it that every single country that I travel to, the people at the borders are nationals of that country. And just last weekend, Mr. Speaker, as I was leaving, going through security again, we run into this issue where we have a lot of different foreign nationalities providing security services at the airport. And, Mr. Speaker, at some point, we have to accept in this world that we're living in, having people getting paid minimum wages in those positions is not something that is conducive. I believe that is high time that we start looking at our own people in terms of providing this service, in terms of protecting our port and other government assets. Mr. Speaker, during one of my jobs, I worked at a bank. And I remember at one point there were various bank robberies that going around, and it was kind of on the rise. And I remember we asking members of the RCIPS to come in to meet with the bank to see what it is that we could do to beef up security. I still remember the superintendent that came that day, and for the meeting, he pretty much, according to him, looked suspicious just to see if the security guard would have even perked up or something. Just been something a little bit different. And during the meeting, he basically told us that didn't happen. This was his first time coming to the bank, and he thought for some strange reason that maybe the security guard would have looked up and said, but wait a minute, this man has never been here before. He's walking around pacing just to see what the guard would have done. And at that point, he suggested to us, he said, while it is not in the police best interest to recommend any particular security services firm, he told us at that point that maybe we should look at a guy, Andrew Copeland of Eagle Eye Security. And his reason for that is that this was one guard that has been around for a long time, and he pretty much would know the criminals. We met with Mr. Copeland, and we told him specifically that we wanted him at the building and nobody else. None of the new arrivals, but rather people who we know. I mean, after all, you have a safe with $1 million in it. People can get creative. And I know there were on 2 occasions that Mr. Copeland had reported to us that he saw some suspicious characters. According to him, one had just even came out of prison, and in his words, when he saw the guy driving through the parking lot and stopping and taking a look, he went over to him just to let him know, according to in his words, bossy, I just might eat a food, So whatever you're thinking of doing, nobody bring it to so something to that effect. But the reality of it is, we had someone who could have seen people scoping the building out, and it made the staff and everyone else a little bit more secure. In my own experience, Mr. Speaker, of even visiting the government admin building, I can tell you some of the security guards there, people would be walking in, and you would think that they would perk up a little bit or something. Sometimes they just sit there casually, and it's just almost like we need people who know Uzu. And one of the complaints I've gotten, Mr. Speaker, since being elected is, in particular, the airport security, where a lot of people feel as if though going through the security when they leave the country. And this is not to take from any particular provider or anyone, but it is time now we have our own people, checking our own people. And at least to some extent can even exercise some level of discretion. I know that there are colleagues in this honorable House, Mr. Speaker, who have been going through the airport and not availing of protocol services, which would be the answer, but nonetheless, this is still something that the traveling public will have to deal with. And I believe that this is something that we need to start rolling out. I don't expect it to be done overnight, but I would like for the government to start with the port and then eventually start looking at other government buildings. I know it's also a factor of cost, Mr. Speaker, in that, we're all looking at places, ways in which we can save money. But when you look at the assets that we have within the government, and also that's not just the physical asset, but also the people asset, we definitely need people that know our people and can actually see some stuff happening. And I think in this case, this is one time we need to be a little bit more proactive as opposed to being reactive. Because sometimes, Mr. Speaker, we have a tendency of getting into the meat of the matter after something bad has happened, and then we start looking at the lessons learned, where I believe that as a gradual phase, this is something we can look at. Now, in terms of how we can implement such a measure, Mr. Speaker, is that as the government goes to renew the different tendering, and I think the Premier may have spoken to this, and I could be wrong, isn't that they're looking for companies or giving more points to companies that have a higher percentage of Caymanians. But at the same time, too, we also need to accept that our way of doing business, that where sometimes we look at the lowest bidder, isn't necessarily the best value for money sometimes. Because in a sense, if we go for the lowest bidder, we're also forcing the vendors to come in with the lowest price. And in a sense, you get what you pay for. If you pay peanuts, expect monkeys to work for you. I mean, not that I'm trying to be rude or anything, but that's the reality of it. And these are government assets and government employees that we're talking about. And in some cases, even within the schools, our own children. You know, we need people who know the troublemakers, who can know which one just came out of prison or which one should be in prison. We need people that are a little bit more vigilant. And I think, Mr. Speaker, not to, I guess, overly push it, but this is something I think the government should start considering doing, but in particular starting with the airports, where we start seeing our own nationals there. If it means paying off-duty policemen or off-duty Caymanian policemen to do this, then so be it. But I think this is someplace where we need to start. Anyway, I don't want to keep anyone much longer, but I just want to put that out there. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Member for Georgetown Central.
Mr. Speaker, I just rise to give the support to the honourable member from Bontown West in respect to his motion.
Does any other member wish to speak? The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the government is happy to consider the motion, the proposal in the motion, I should say. But let me say with this caveat or condition, most of the security services provided to government buildings is outsourced. So there's been a tender process and a security company has won the contract. We are, and the advice we have, are not inclined to really change that arrangement, because to do so would mean that government might be taking on as many as another 200, 250, 300 possibly new staff members. Security services, those that are provided round the clock, and even those that are maybe 12 hours a day, require a great deal of personnel, because people have to work on shifts and you have to make provision for when people are ill and when they're on vacation. So we are really not inclined to increase the number of government employees that significantly in one fell swoop. But what the government is prepared to do and is already doing in some instances is to look at the proposed contracts again in the next tendering cycle, and to consider writing into those contracts provisions for minimum number of Caymanians being employed, and also perhaps to look at what the salaries are for the people that are being paid. Because, Mr. Speaker, I think we can have some control or some influence, probably a better word, influence over whether or not the jobs are viable as far as Caymanians are concerned. The member from Bontown West spoke about minimum wage jobs or minimum wage pay for what really are very important roles, particularly security at the government buildings and at the airport and at the port. And we agree with him that these ought to be better remunerated generally. Obviously, and he recognized that it's going to be an impact on government, on the government budget, government expenditure. But we believe that the trade-off is important enough that we consider it. If we pay better, we are likely to get better people taking the jobs, and people tend to be a bit more committed to a job if they feel that they're being fairly remunerated. So the government takes the spirit of the motion fully on board. And as I say, we'll consider this, and I hope that we will be able to advise this House in not too distant future of how we have sought to improve this particular situation. We do take very seriously the fact that the vast number of security personnel are actually non-Caymanians, and in some areas this can be a particular concern. Mr. Speaker, this is not directly related to the motion, but it is something I think that the House should be thinking about, and the government certainly should be thinking about, and that is the overall administration, for lack of a better term, of the whole security industry. Quite frankly, most security personnel that we have now are little more than lookouts, because they have no means of defending themselves, let alone anyone else, if there is any threat. And we really have to look again at the kind of training that is provided for security officers and what we as a country are prepared to allow them to carry by way of defensive mechanism. I'm trying not to say weapons. Means of defending themselves and the people and institutions that they are being paid to help secure. This is obviously a discussion that we have to have with the Commissioner of Police and perhaps even higher up the chain, because it involves issues involving security. But we really have to think again about what we have, because in most instances, it is just a false sense of security that we create by having these people walking around with nice-looking uniforms on, when, quite frankly, they can't do much more else than raise an alarm or make a phone call, because they're in no position really to effect proper security, whether it's at the airport or at the government administration building or at a school. So I think we need to really look again at these measures. We might as well get away from this idea that we don't really have to worry too much about security in Cayman. I think we're past that point now where we have to stop pretending that we don't have serious security concerns in this country from time to time. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Savannah?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As seconder, I rise to support this motion, and I'm pleased to see that government will consider. I think it would be interesting if we find out what the security companies actually charge government and how much they pay to their employees. The Premier indicated what could be a vast cost if we increase the members of the civil service. So, but as you indicated, Mr. Premier, that it's something that will be taken under consideration. There are times when we as representatives go to the government administration building or other facilities and they look at us like we came from another planet. I think that our own people there, what I would suggest, and I'll draw an example, the former Sergeant of Arms of this Legislative Assembly, Mr. Sheen Bothwell, the remarkable job I'm made to understand he's doing at head of security at the airport, whether it's the Civil Aviation Authority or one of those there. He has quite a bit of plans and stuff for there. We also have retired police officers who are looking some bread ends. We have people who have served in the military that has come back here, that's retired. I'm sure they would be welcome. And people like this we could certainly consider as we go forward. There's not a lot of weak Caymanians that would fill into that place, but at least the Premier has indicated that they will give consideration. And we have to start somewhere in changing the philosophy of how we operate within our government systems. When you go overseas and come back and see the integrity and the firmness with which they do these things, it behoves us, well, God forbid, as one of the outstanding financial centers in the world, that we are protected. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member from Newlands?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish to briefly add my support for this motion as well. Mr. Speaker, I take note that the mover actually made reference to issues with individuals who are now providing security services who are not very familiar with these islands, or in cases of the honorable members in this assembly, even knowing who we are from time to time. I've had incidents where, at one incident, I was actually the acting Minister of Sports in a previous life, not too long ago, and pulling up at the sports complex, Mr. Speaker, I parked in the designated spot, only to be told by a security guard that I had to move because that spot was being reserved for the acting Minister of Sports. So I had to explain to him who I was and show him my ID, and it was a bit frustrating. And I've had incidents coming to this honorable house, Mr. Speaker, on special occasions. On one occasion, I was blocked from coming into the gate by a security personnel and told that I wasn't allowed to come in here. This is for members of the LA only. So we do have issues with familiarity. And while you can't blame the individuals because they're new to the country and they don't know who we are, it does give rise for concern. And I'll say this because, Mr. Speaker, one of the highest office in this country sits across from us here as the Honorable Premier. And say what you want about the man, but the office that he holds is the highest office in this country. And I have seen on one occasion, I don't know if he even noticed it, Mr. Speaker, but I did. We were at a function at the sports complex, and someone decided to take a shortcut through the VIP booth and ran directly in front of the Premier, almost stepped on his foot. And in my mind, first thing I thought, Mr. Speaker, was, why is this person running towards the Premier? Now, no one tried to stop him, no one tried to intervene. And it was this sort of lackadaisical approach to security that really bothered me. And I thought, you know, the country that I'm most familiar with next to Cayman is Jamaica. And I thought to myself, had that been Jamaica and someone ran towards the Prime Minister, there would have been a much different reaction. So we really need to start taking these incidents a bit more serious and taking the threats, as the Premier said, Mr. Speaker, a bit more serious. And I think this is one way that we can make inroads in doing that because, you know, we know our own and they know us. And I think the level of respect is there. Mr. Speaker, I also think it's time for us to grow up in a sense. We know that the notion of reserving certain occupations for Caymanians only meets with a lot of criticism from time to time, and they say that we're encouraging this mentality that we're entitled. But Mr. Speaker, there are certain jobs in this country which we have no excuse for a Caymanian not having that job. And this, I think, in my opinion, is one of them. You know, there are certain roles in society now that it should be automatic. It shouldn't even be a debate about it. This is one area I think that we can make inroads in employing Caymanians. And I remember the former Minister of Finance discussing the very same idea that he wanted to employ retired police officers and so forth at the government administration building to perform security services. So I think his thinking fits right in with this motion as well. Mr. Speaker, as mentioned by the member from Bordentown West, this also helps in attacking, in a small way, but it attacks the issue that we have with cheap labor in this country. While these jobs are, as he said, minimum wage jobs, they are very critical and very important. And I think that the compensation for these roles should reflect that, because we do run the real risk, and I've seen it, and I think we all can think of examples where the individuals who come here and take up these jobs may not be the best suited individuals or most experienced. And as he said, you pay peanuts, you get monkeys. So this is another way that we can, without causing major disruption, start to chip away at that cheap labor market. And I do support the motion for that reason, Mr. Speaker. And while, as the Premier indicated, it will take some time to implement their contracts in place and so on, we can start incrementally doing this and hopefully get the buy-in from the security companies. I don't want to see them lose their contracts, but what I want to see more of is them hiring Caymanians to fill these roles. So if there's a spirit of cooperation between the government and the providers, then I think it can be easily accomplished. And we can put some Caymanians to work in professions that will help them help themselves. If you consider the disposable income that will be going into the pockets of those individuals, those Caymanians, they will have more money to spend, take care of themselves and their families. And that then stops the government, because we keep hearing that each budget cycle about the government having to do more to help the indigent, more to help pensioners. This is a simple decision-making process that we have to go through, Mr. Speaker, which pocket it comes out of. You pay contracts to put Caymanians to work, which feeds the economy, or you write social service checks, NAU checks. It's as simple as that. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few short words, I commend the member for bringing this. I wholeheartedly support it, and I think most members will. And I look forward to the vote. Thank you.
The Honourable Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise to just give a few short comments after the Premier has said the government is of mind to consider this. Private Member's Motion number 9, 2017-2018. Mr. Speaker, I think that the motion is very timely, and I've certainly taken note of the speakers that have spoke after it was moved, and the indication from the Premier that the government is of the mind to consider it, I believe shows that we all understand the issue that is in front of us here. We also have the challenge that every month or so, new regulations come out of how our borders are to be secured. So this has moved to where it's not supposed to be a low-paying job anymore. It's supposed to be a job that requires a skill and training. And I'm extremely pleased to stand here in front of you today and tell you that 86 people work in security at the Cayman Island Airport Authority, and every one of them are Caymanian. It is now out for 15 new officers to be hired and to be trained. And as has been said before, the balance that we seek is, as we look at the private contractors, how do we encourage them to, number one, meet the standard, and number two, bring Caymanians on to replace the permit holders that they have. And I think that the timely issue of this, as was brought up, in the budget cycle, it's going to cost more. And it's not an easy task at this point when you have statutory authorities and you have ministries who have set their budget of what they're going to pay, and the mover put a time limit on this, which I think was right from the standpoint it gave some time, but in fairness, it may take more time. But the comfort that the government can give you today is that this is being actioned, and we can show you real examples of how they're moving forward. And the exact idea that you gave of giving extra points when you put out contracts is a real example of things that have been discussed at board levels and at ministry levels. So again, from my ministry and the statutory authorities that come under my ministry, we are actioning this, and we're quite happy to engage with other ideas that you might have, that we move this forward together. Thank you.
The Honorable Deputy Governor.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. Just to say from the civil service side, we joined with the Premier and others in supporting this motion. Mr. Speaker, I think this, in the second conversation I had with the Premier after he was returned, this is exactly the conversation he had with me in terms of how can we ensure that we get more Caymanians, security guards into government buildings. So it's something that's been on our radar for a while. It's been talked about, and I think it's time now that we do take that action. I think, Mr. Speaker, we have two different scenarios. We have persons that actually greet people when they come into a building, and then there is security. And I think what is happening now is that we're having security guards asking them to be ambassadors, and then we're asking sometimes ambassadors to be security. So I think it's very important, first of all, that we identify when a security guard is needed and when it's really an ambassador. And who better to be an ambassador for in a government building, anywhere at the airport is a Caymanian. Who better to take you upstairs to a minister or to meet with the Premier or Deputy Premier or anyone than a Caymanian? So we on the civil service side is behind this 100%. We will certainly work together with the government, with anyone, to see how we can achieve this in the shortest period of time and ensure that we're doing the right thing for the right reasons. Thank you, sir.
If no other member wishes to speak, I'll call on the mover for his right of reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank the government and everyone who spoke in supporting this bill. And like I said, I think it was just a matter of time before we needed to start looking at this kind of stuff. The only thing I would say is that from a priority standpoint, I would definitely like to start with the airport, especially for outbound passengers when they're leaving. And again, this is not to take anything from any private contractor, but recognizing that the more Caymanians we can have at the port of entries and exit, I think will bode well for us. But overall, I'm pleased to see that the government is considering it. And I also want to thank the Premier, the Deputy Premier, and the Deputy Governor for also for adding their remarks and also their support of it. So thank you.
The question is, be it therefore resolved that the government considers employing all Caymanians to provide static security services at all government, statutory, and public buildings before December 31st, 2018. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. The motion is duly passed.
Private Amendment Motion number 10 of 2017-18, Education Fund, to be moved by the elected member for Bontown West and seconded by the elected member for Savannah.
The member from Bontown West.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I rise to move private members motion number 10 of 2017-18, Education Fund. Whereas there is much public support for investment in education, and whereas there is concern among many Caymanians that the foreign exchange rate between the Cayman Islands dollar and the United States dollar is too high for a risk-free currency, and whereas there are many companies with approved business staffing plans that require scholarships be granted to Caymanians annually, And whereas this Legislative Assembly has created funds over the years to protect our environment and other natural resources, be it therefore resolved that the government considers establishing an education fund to assist with the development and advancement of education in the Cayman Islands, and be it further resolved that the government considers funding this education fund with 50% of the foreign exchange spread earned by banks' transaction between Cayman Islands dollars and the United States dollars, and be it further resolved that the government considers funding this education fund by giving companies the option of paying into the education fund an equivalent amount as per their approved business staffing plan. Thank you.
Is there a seconder? Elected member for Savannah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to second the motion.
The question now before the House is that be it therefore resolved that the government considers establishing an education fund to assist with the development and advancement of education in the Cayman Islands, and be it further resolved that the government considers funding this education fund with 50% of the foreign exchange spread earned by banks transacting between the Cayman Islands dollar and the United States dollar, and be it further resolved that the government considers funding this education fund by giving companies the option of paying into the education fund, an equivalent amount as per their approved business staffing plan. Does the mover wish to speak there at all?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Just to give members the genesis of this motion, quite a while back, I was having a conversation with the honorable member from Savannah, and I can actually say this was actually his idea in terms of planting the seed, in terms of creating something like that. In terms of, he had mentioned for all his years in this legislative house, that was one of the things he always looked at. And, I said to him, well, you know what, I think this is something worth looking at, especially at this point with the budget coming up. As we were going through the budget, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't help but notice on page 356 of the planning estimates that list the reserves, that there were several different reserve funds that the government has already. And just for the record, there's a housing loan reserve fund, an environmental protection fund, an infrastructure development fund, general reserves, student loan reserves, national disaster fund, and a debt sinking fund. And while I support the concept behind all of these funds, Mr. Speaker, I think the one fund that we need to make sure that we also add to that list is one where we invest in our people. During this process, the budget process, Mr. Speaker, I can say, and this being my first budget in this House, that as a government, we do a lot for our people. Unfortunately, the government, in my opinion, is taking on too big a burden in this country, and it's a burden that is unsustainable. And, Mr. Speaker, we need to start, the private sector in this country, Mr. Speaker, need to start carrying their weight. Simply put. One of the things, Mr. Speaker, as you may recall, I was a member of the Business Staff and Plan Board. And one of the things that jumped out at me as a member of that board was the amount of companies that we had that had different approved business staff and plan that required them to do a scholarship each year for Caymanians, or at least one scholarship to each Caymanian. And there were a lot of companies that were actually delinquent when that time came up, as we were going through looking for updates and everything else. Now, some made the argument that they couldn't find any students that were qualified, or they went looking. But the truth of the fact is, Mr. Speaker, I think they need to be doing a lot more. I mean, this is not something that we're begging them to do. This is something that they're required to do. And since they're not giving the scholarship out to our Caymanians, at a minimum, we think that they should be paying into the fund to make sure that the government at least finds a way to at least add more money in terms of scholarship and everything else. And like I said, Mr. Speaker, this is not something that we're begging. This is something that they're required to do. And many companies have not. And as sad as it may sound, many of these companies are also prominent companies that have just not paid anything into the fund. And I think at a minimum, this will just require the Immigration Department to send a letter out to all the companies with approved business staffing plans and ask them for an update on their scholarship. And if not, if there's no update provided at a minimum, then give them the option of paying into the fund, and we will find a way to disperse it to Caymanians that need further education. See, Mr. Speaker, when you look at these funds and you see what they're for, it's something designed towards the future. And I think at a minimum, each year, as we have more Caymanians wanting to go off to school, and then we saw the amount of money that the government again had to set aside in terms of sending more kids off to school, I think we can be doing a lot more. And it's not just overseas scholarship too, Mr. Speaker, but also the money in this fund can be used, especially for adult education. Because one of the things that we have done, Mr. Speaker, is that for decades we have put this idea out there that businesses must train and develop Caymanians. No, that was always our responsibility. And for many Caymanians who have worked for small businesses who couldn't afford to send them off to school or even further education, this is one way of paying for it. So rather than have businesses sit back and basically just get away from their required duty that they said that they're supposed to be doing, I think this is one option of doing it, and you can get money to kickstart the fund. The second notion in terms of seeding the fund, Mr. Speaker, and I'll be the first to admit it, I thought long and hard about it, but the banks have been getting away with murder. And you know what? I thought about one of the best ways in which we can get something back from them for the people, because, Mr. Speaker, some of you would be old enough to remember I wasn't around when the Cayman dollar first came around. And the argument was that because it was uncertainty and so much uncertainty, there was a broad spread of 4 cents between the US and the CI. Now, people may see that's 4 cents, but just to kind of give you an idea what that 4 cents represent, that 4 cents is actually 3.2%. And if you look at even the prime rate, Mr. Speaker, this lowest the other day, it was actually 3.25% for the longest. There's no currency around the world, Mr. Speaker, that is pegged to the US on a flat rate where the spread is that high. And for the banks to be making 3.2% off a currency that is pegged, that has now for more than 4 decades proven to be stable, I think it is really, I don't use the word, I'm not going to use that word, but I'm going to kind of watch my word, but it's wrong. It is wrong. So we have two options. Either A, we kind of push them to lower that rate now in terms of the peg, which would help a lot of Caymanians, or B, if they want to keep it, then you know what? Let us take it and do something with it. But to really sit down there, Mr. Speaker, in this day and age, going into 2018, more than 40 years to have a currency pegged to the US with a 3.2% spread is literally unheard of, and is one of the last things that we need to do in terms of the Cayman Islands dollar. I think we have proven ourselves from that standpoint. Now, I know the government is committed to no new taxes and everything else, so I can understand where they're coming from, but at a minimum, this isn't a tax. This is just basically taking back something that the people is being charged too much for and putting it to good use. Yeah. So with that, Mr. Speaker, that's one of the things that we wanted to kind of put out there, but just to create the fund first, and then secondly, look at ways in which we can seed the fund, put money in the fund. The other option I actually toyed with, Mr. Speaker, and this is something that many members may not be familiar with, but surprisingly or not, the pension fund, the pensions at this point also have dormant funds. Now, Mr. Speaker, you may remember when you were Premier, we had about, I think it was about 20, 30 million sitting in the banks at that time that were dormant. And what was happening is that the banks were just running the fees out of these accounts, making basically money for nothing. And Mr. Speaker, I was glad to see where you moved the motion to take that dormant money and say, you know what, if there's anybody who's going to hold on to dormant money, let it be the Caymanian people. We also have the same situation now, Mr. Speaker, with the pensions. in that there are dormant pensions accounts, believe it or not, even though some people have gone and everything else, that the fees are just being run out. And these companies are just making money from the fees from this. The reality of it is that if there's money to be made on dormant accounts or on foreign exchange for a currency that's already proven itself, let it be the Caymanian people, and let us use those kind of funds to pretty much seed this education fund and start looking to the future. We can, there also, Mr. Speaker, as you are aware, a lot of SPVs in Cayman that as they wind up, that money has to be given to charity. And we can structure this fund in such a way where it can also receive those funds also in terms of putting it. But the whole idea, Mr. Speaker, is to set aside something, a vehicle, in which we can encourage other people, companies, or whatever we can think of, to seed it, to fund it, and see if we can start investing in our future. So it's not about anything other than just say, let us start looking at how we can best invest in our people and start setting money aside. Now, one of the things I was glad for, which I didn't know prior to this budget process, was even the student loan reserve. Because I kind of looked at that and was wondering if it was something similar to what we were proposing. But that is something that the government has set aside for the loans that they actually guarantee for students going overseas. Now, I don't know what the status is on those guarantees or if it has been looked at, but if government is even no longer required for some of those guarantees, maybe they can even look at moving some of that funds at even seeding the education fund if they agree to create it. And Mr. Speaker, I recognize that this is the last motion standing in for us to leave this house, and I'm fighting the flu still. So I'm still very nasal. So I will leave it for now, and I'll invite members to add their 2 cents. Thanks, Mr. Speaker.
Does the member from Savannah?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I rise to speak on the motion, as the mover indicated that from probably late last year or early this year when he indicated he was interested in politics, we had this discussion. And the whole emphasis of this, Mr. Speaker, is specifically to help our education situation. For far too long, Mr. Speaker, we have sat around here. Let's face it, these banks with a spread of 4 cents, as my colleague said, 3.2, I'm not sure what the final is. But let's face it, from time I can remember, even before I came into politics, they had all kind of excuses why they had to have this spread. What they don't tell us, Mr. Speaker, that when we go to buy US dollars, we pay 85 cents. If we put that same US in our CI accounts, they give us 80 cents credit. I think it's time, Mr. Speaker, that this stop, one way or the other. They just seem to continually nitpick. More fees, more bank charges. And I'll give you a personal example, Mr. Speaker. One of the banks, we had a little CD in, told us to open a savings account. That a couple of pennies, interest you got on it, they would put in the savings account. Then every month, they took a service fee off of the savings account. This nonsense has got to stop. We have heard firsthand of a person go in, probably one of the low earners or construction people, excuse me, go cash their check, whatever amount it is, $5, $10, come off of that. We really have to look at this seriously, and I'm eagerly await to hear why the banks and the institutions that, as much as they've made in these islands, Mr. Speaker, over the umpteen years, 40+ years, why it's not time for them to start to contribute to the development of especially our young people through the education process. They should be ashamed of themselves, Mr. Speaker, as far as I'm concerned, that they are not making when you look at, let's look bluntly at the law firms, the accounting firms, and the banking industry. What are they putting back in these islands? Yes, they employ many Caymanians, which is good. I guess the next thing you know, that they're going to be charging us for putting our money into the bank. Anyway, Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to share with you that this is something I wondered over many, many years. There's always some lame duck excuse why it can't be done. I think we said 2 cents in this, but let us try to get a grip on this and find out really what's going on and try to do something to benefit our people, to take the pressure off of our government system. I don't have to tell my colleagues on that side, Label, Minister of Education, and all of us know the needs for education. Let us look at novel ways of trying to get money for them without raising taxes on our people. We've got to stop this pussyfooting around, Mr. Speaker, and do something positive. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? The Honorable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't trying to play a game. I was trying to hear what the arguments on the other side were before I answered on behalf of the government, so we would be able to answer more fulsomely without 2 or 3 members having to get up. Mr. Speaker, we believe that the proposal to establish an education fund is a good one. And that, Mr. Speaker, is a resolution the government is more than happy to not just consider, but to accept. Mr. Speaker, the resolution with respect to the funding of this fund by giving options to companies who have business staffing plans, giving them the option of paying in to this fund is something the government is quite prepared to consider, particularly as I indicated in previous speeches in this House. This meeting, we're looking at the whole business of immigration reform and work permit reform, and particularly the business staffing plan concept. So that is, Mr. Speaker, something the government is happy to consider in the overall context of it. But, Mr. Speaker, we are a little concerned at some of the tone really, and perhaps some of the rhetoric relating to the banks. And we certainly don't want, the government certainly doesn't want to join the chorus of condemnation and proposals to penalize banks. Mr. Speaker, we know that there are issues with some of the bank charges and others, and the government is looking, as we've indicated, about what we can do about that. But in case anyone is not paying attention to the statistics, you will see the dramatic and worrying fall in the number of banking institutions registered in these islands, a trend which seems to be continuing. And so the government has to be cognizant, Mr. Speaker, of the kind of messages we send from the floor of this House or from elsewhere about how we value or don't the business of banks in this country and the significant employment of Caymanians they have provided over the course of many years. And, Mr. Speaker, quite frankly, we have concerns and would be unable to accept the second resolution at this stage without further careful analysis and consideration by those who advise us on these sorts of issues about the impact this would have on local banks and our banks in Cayman before we could could consider that matter. And so, Mr. Speaker, the proposal of the government, and I hope that you are able, sir, to accommodate this, is if the motion could be put and each resolution put separately, so that there would be a vote on each resolution rather than the overall motion, because as I've indicated, the government is prepared to accept the first and second resolves of the motion. That is the establishment of the fund, and that the government consider funding the education fund by giving companies the option of paying into the fund on the basis of undertakings. It's a long, tired undertakings they give as part of the business staffing plan application and approval of those. So, Mr. Speaker, with those few observations, I think I've spoken on behalf of the government and our approach to this particular motion.
The chair is prepared, and our standing orders provides that we can vote separately on the first resolved, on each one, in fact, on each resolved section separately. The member for Northside, the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm happy to hear that the government will accept 2 of the resolutions in the motion, but I would also lean on the government to accept the 3rd one, since it's only to consider it. Because information we have is that the resistance that they find may not be as strong as they believe it would be at this point in time. Because even if you, in the process of considering it, you negotiate with the bank and we wind up with only 1 cent out of the 4 cents, putting it in something into an education fund, I believe would add substantial amount of money to the fund. Guesstimates that we have been given on a 2-2 split would be some in the region of 20+ million. No, I understand that, but I'm just, but we're asking the government to consider this, and I would ask that they also consider the 3rd option, because I don't think it's just an option that should just be given up or eliminated because we don't have enough evidence at this time. We're not asking the government to accept that they're going to do that, but I would really encourage the government to accept that they would consider doing it. And if in the consideration and the negotiation with the banks and the fund, if it's going to destroy the banking industry, obviously we can't do it. But suppose the banks would in fact accept, because the banks are not really in the business of making money off FedEx. They have different departments that do that. And this should really not have a terrible effect on the economy because the money is already being collected. All we're asking the banks to do is to share a portion of what they're collecting on a very stable and well-funded currency to assist with the development of our people and investing in the human resources from which they will benefit. Because it is almost unacceptable that in this day and age, when Cayman has been in the banking business for, 45 years? And 15 years ago, we had 3 Caymanian bank managers, and today we don't have any. If their argument on that, for being in that position, is that Caymanians need to be better educated and better prepared, this is something that they don't have to pay for. This is what they're charging their customers for. So all we're asking them is to share that with us. So I would really implore the government to accept the 3rd section of it, that it's just being considered. You're not accepting it, you're going to do it. The second one, but I believe it is worthy of consideration and having a conversation with the banking industry. If it turns out to be such a terrible thing to them, then we can always come back and say, well, we couldn't do it because of this, and those reasons given us to the bank. But I believe to leave the option or the possibility of collecting even 10 million to put into education for our people through scholarships, I wouldn't would encourage the government not to just walk away from it and leave it on the table. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Does any other member wish to speak? The member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to give support to this motion that has been brought to this Honorable House on behalf of the member for Bontown West. I think there is much merit into what he's done in respect to his research and his analysis. I think we'd all agree in here that Mr. Saunders is a well-versed individual in respect to the financial industry and the workings of it. So that being said, I am in full support of his motion, being both parts of the motion. But Mr. Speaker, I am concerned that both speakers before the Premier has given their assessment to this motion and their thoughts and given examples of what they've felt and seen and heard in the banking industry with much local interaction. And then I'm concerned, which leads me to concern when the Premier uses the word that he heard a lot of rhetoric from the opposition. I think the opposition took this motion seriously as an approach to address the problem. And I don't think that what was said before the Honorable Premier stood up was in any way any rhetoric. I don't think, Mr. Speaker, that the Honorable Anthony Eden in his time here in this Honorable House as second in line to being the grandfather of this Honorable House is a man that comes here to give rhetoric. And I think the opposition should be given the due respect to say that when they propose something here, it's something that they truly believe in, have done their homework on, and is presenting to this Honorable House as a way to find solutions to the people of this country. Mr. Speaker, I took the opportunity to just quickly do a Google search to refresh my mind of the word rhetoric and the meaning of it. It says speech or discourse that pretends to signify its significance but lacks truth and meaning. I don't think that the two members who spoke before the Honorable Premier came to give this Honorable House anything to make them or try to trick them into believing something different than what they've said. But that being said, Mr. Speaker, I want to encourage particularly the member from Bontown West to continue to use his skill set that he's studied very hard in respect to examining the figures and numbers and structures of finances in this country to find solutions for this country, because he continues to present options that are available for us to succeed as a people. That being said, Mr. Speaker, I give him my full support in respect to this motion.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? If not, I'll call on a move. The member for Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just wanted to give a brief contribution and voice my support for this motion as well. Brought by the member from Bontown West and seconded by the member from Savannah. And I must say I'm disappointed that the government is not going to consider all of the resolutions of this motion. Mr. Speaker, we all came here a few weeks ago to consider the budget for this country. And much of that discussion within this Honorable House and before that, much of the discussion has been on education. The members you see sitting on this side of this Honorable House, Mr. Speaker, I don't think it's any secret now, we went on a crusade for education And I'm happy to see that, and it hasn't stopped, we will continue as long as necessary. And I'm happy to see that there have been provisions in this budget to support education, and I am appreciative of the government for hearing us and responding. However, Mr. Speaker, there is much more that needs to be done for education in this country. Mr. Speaker, I hear the concerns about the banking industry, the decline in banks, and just in case anyone has any doubt, no one on this side of this honorable House, Mr. Speaker, wants to cause harm to our banking industry. But Mr. Speaker, I only have to point back less than 2 years ago when I brought a motion to this honorable House asking for electronic clearings, and I won't go into it. But I brought that motion, Mr. Speaker, because diplomacy didn't work, discussions with the banks didn't work, and here we are, the beginning of a new term, new budget cycle, and we still don't have electronic clearance in this country. But the banks continue to benefit, Mr. Speaker, from the float created by the gap between clearing a check, which could be as much as 3 to 4 days. So I want to turn that concern around. Yes, we are concerned about the banks, the banking industry, our financial services, Mr. Speaker, but we are also concerned about our people. And for too long, we have wavered in being strong in our approach because we don't want to be anti-business, we don't want to scare away business, we don't want to give the impression that we're heavy-handed as a government, and I agree with all of that, Mr. Speaker. But where are we going to be 10 years from now if we do not take the responsibility for educating our people in our own hands and do something about it? Mr. Speaker, this country, we have seen the social problems. I won't revive that debate, Mr. Speaker. We have seen the crime. We have seen and heard the complaints from our people. We need to educate them. Former member of this House, Mr. Speaker, and I brought a motion asking for 10% of work permit revenues to be used towards educating and training our people. Nothing has been done. And here's another solution, another idea from a young, educated, experienced Caymanian, member of this honorable House, Mr. Speaker, that simply needs some consideration. We're not saying go out and do it right away. Simply consider what the members are asking for in their motion. If we continue to and I'll borrow a word, Mr. Speaker, from my colleague in Savannah, to pussyfoot around with this, they will never take us seriously. We need a government that is going to be strong, not heavy-handed, not overly aggressive, but strong in its stance. And I know I'll get beat up a little bit now when the next person gets up, Mr. Speaker. I know that. But I had to say it.
Honourable member, please bear in mind the rule of tedious repetition of your own or of another's argument.
I didn't follow you, but I'll bow to your ruling, Mr. Speaker. I wasn't sure what I was repeating.
That's good.
But I'll move on. Mr. Speaker.
Just a minute. Listen. This chair value the rules of the House. And I keep repeating that I was told over and often on radios, he's taking that position, I hope he can abide by the rules. I merely point out the rules. Don't get into an argument with me about what I think of this country. You all know, anybody on that side, I heard it. Everybody knows where I stand on these matters. But these things have been dragged over and over and over, and we don't want to get into tedious repetition. That's a rule. Honorable members, debate as long as you got to 2 hours, and members want to stay as long as it's not tedious repetition of your own argument or of somebody else's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have a conservation fund, and we've seen on a few occasions where the government has taken funds from the fund, environmental fund, my apologies. We've drawn down on those funds.
Mr. Speaker, a point of order.
Honorable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the government hasn't taken anything. The government can take nothing from the fund. The fund is accessible only by resolution of this House. And I would ask the member not to mislead the House or the broader public in saying the government has taken anything. The fund has been accessed on a number of occasions by virtue of a resolution of the House, and on each and every occasion in the recent past, the member has been present and a member of this House when that resolution was passed.
Honourable member from New Orleans, please rephrase your argument.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I wasn't making a criticism at all. I was actually, well, maybe my wording was incorrect, Mr. Speaker. We have drawn down, the House has resolved to draw down on those funds to further our conservation efforts. And the government has the majority to do that, and it's their remit to do that if they feel it's necessary. I wasn't criticizing the government, Mr. Speaker. I was simply saying that it has come in handy. It has been there in times when you need to do something for the country. That fund has been there, and well, Mr. Speaker, if I can finish my debate, I think the member would agree with me once I'm done. I'm simply stating, Mr. Speaker, that that fund and other funds are critically important to this country, and so should an education fund. So I am happy to hear, and I'm sure the member will be happy to hear me say this, Mr. Speaker, that they are going to consider doing that. That's the point I'm trying to make. But Mr. Speaker, we have to hold all stakeholders in this country to task. And I know that some will argue that it's not the business community's business about educating our people. But we have rules, we have laws, we have requirements in place that they must abide by. And I'm moving on, Mr. Speaker, to the business staffing plans and the idea that some of the funding for this can come from that regime. And I know that the Honorable Premier has said that he will look to revamp the business staffing plan, so I won't get into that heavily. But just to underscore that, Mr. Speaker, there is, we know, a lot of potential in using the requirements of the business staffing plan regime to add to the fund that would be created by this motion. Mr. Speaker, I won't belabor the point. I can see that I've already lost most of my target audience. But, Mr. Speaker, we want to see, and I'm speaking for the opposition, we want to see the Cayman Islands rise, especially in the area of education. We want to see the Cayman Islands become known as the jewel of the Caribbean. I've said it before, for education as well. The same old approach is not going to do that. What we need are new, innovative ideas to be explored. Throw away the ones that won't work, but at least give the commitment to discussing it, to considering it. And that's all the opposition is asking for. That's all these two honorable members are asking for tonight, is just a commitment to think about it. That is it. But if we don't start being creative and innovative in our approach, we are not going to get there, Mr. Speaker. And so I will support this motion. And I'm asking the government members, Mr. Speaker, to please also consider all of the resolutions of this motion. I don't see the harm in that. I really don't. Hopefully, there'll be a change of heart. I'll wait to see, Mr. Speaker, but this motion has my full support. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? Deputy Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise for a few short comments on private members' motion number 10/2017-2018. First, I want to compliment the mover on his motion, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the other members that have spoke, I believe their representation is that they want the same thing that the government wants. We want a better education system for every person in the Cayman Islands. And how we do that is to put best effort, our best thoughts, and our best practice together and move forward. I want to just give my comments on the Premier's representation for the government and how he looked at the resolved sections and the thought process behind it. Therefore, resolved that the government considers establishing an education fund to assist with the development and advancement of education in the Cayman Islands. Agreed. Agreed to the point that when you sit down to establish the fund, we would do it in a way that everybody has input. If it's a caucus meeting or if it's a special meeting that the Premier has called, the ideas that flow from that could very well be a percentage from the bank. It could very well be how the banks contribute. But break it out into the financial industry along with the banks, because each one of those want a successful education program in this country. This morning, I was at a young lady who was called to the bar, and one of her family members, a very prominent businessman here, talked about the need for more education, need for participation. We all agree on this. But the message that comes into the next resolution that says a bank has to consider a specific area of how they make money. The bank is going to give you a bottom line profit at the end of the year. They're going to publish it in the paper. It's going to be a public record that you can go and get. There are some things in that made money, and there are some things that cost money. There's a cost for them to do business. So although they may make 2 cents in a dollar, 3.8 cents in a dollar, or 4 cents if it's cash, that's not all profit that they put in their pocket. So when you say to them and you message them and you say, I'm going to pick the one that you make money off, I want half of that. But when you have to pay to clean the floors and when you have to pay for security, I'm not going to contribute to that. I don't think that's what you want. I don't think that's what we want. I don't think that's what anybody wants. What we want is the business community, the banks, to join with us and contribute to this fund in a meaningful way. And the idea of us saying a specific thing, I think, is counterproductive. And that's all the government is saying. The government is not trying to say that we're not wanting to participate in a certain resolve. The other part of it, Mr. Speaker, The Premier has made it very clear, and members have spoke about the business staffing and the revamping and how that would contribute. I think we're all in agreement with that. So let us not leave here today thinking that we're not all on the same page with this and that we're not all committed to working together to get this done. And I say to the mover and the seconder, you'll have our support in the spirit and in the support and the resolves that we can support. Thank you.
Does any other member wish to speak? Does any other member wish to speak? I call on the mover for his right to reply.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, when I first came into this House, I spoke about 2 interviews that I saw. One was done, I think, 1977 by Michael Manley when he was in New York visiting the United Nations. And I said, after seeing that interview, if anyone who watches it didn't walk off being a fan of Michael Manley, clearly something be wrong with him. I also said, Mr. Speaker, that the other interview that I wanted people to look at was the interview that Michael Manley did a year before he died and a year before and a year after he left office. And one of the things that jumped out during that interview that has remained with me, Mr. Speaker, is where the interviewer asked him the question, how could you have gotten everything so right in theory and everything went so wrong in practical? Something along that line. To which Manley replied, again, just paraphrasing, he learned 3 lessons. 1, he used language that frightened the business community, and as a result, he lost investors and businesses in his country. 2, he used language that frightened the middle class, that resulted in one of the biggest brain drain that Jamaica ever had, that up to the time of that interview, he still regretted. And 3, he overestimated the political awareness of the Jamaican people. When I put this motion together, Mr. Speaker, I knew a part of it would have been on the government side, and I accept that sitting on this side, I can be a little bit more liberal in the language I choose to use, as opposed to what the Premier may choose to use, for the simple fact that when it leaves his mouth, it becomes policy. When it leaves my mouth, it's pretty much an idea. So I can understand the reservation the government has, and I'm not going to take that from them. At the end of the day, one of the things that I did say, and the last thing that I want, Mr. Speaker, not tell anybody, recognizing that 10 years ago we had almost 600 banks, today we have less than 200, is at the same time putting in anything. Now, Mr. Speaker, what I can say is that I believe we as a country failed, is that at the time when there was plenty, we never set aside for future generations. And this is something that has now come due on this generation. We have seen it with the pension, and we have seen it with the health, where we have never planned far enough in the future. I look at Saudi Arabia, Mr. Speaker, who's also planning on recognizing that oil will run out one day and that they need to transform their own society. We cannot expect in this House to, within 4 years, change mistakes of 40 years ago, overnight. The problems weren't created overnight, and they won't be fixed overnight. But what we're looking for is the little small corrections, the little 1, 2, 3 degrees, that once you start on that path and you continue, within 5, 10 years, that 3, 4 degree shift can become 17, 18, 25 degrees down in the future. That's really what it is that we're looking for. It's about planning. Mr. Speaker, prior to the sitting of the last House, when we were doing the SPS, I remember you and I having a discussion in your private office where we spoke about the need for a national development plan. This year is 20 years since Vision 2008, and we have been running this country for far too long without a national development plan, a national strategic plan. And it is high time that members in this House, on both sides, start looking in terms of creating that 2030 plan or whatever it is that we want the Cayman Islands to look like in at least for the next 10, 15 years. We, politically, Mr. Speaker, there's no major difference in ideologies. Most of us believe in the same system that we have right now. Where our differences lie is more in management style and management priorities. But we're pretty much on the same page. And I think it is that level of stability that have allowed the Cayman Islands to remain one of the best places to do business on this planet. So I do understand to some extent certain reservations in terms of rocking the boat, and I have no issues with that. But what I would say to the government, just as I said to you, Mr. Speaker, when you were Premier, to look at the dormant accounts, I will say to the government, look at the dormant pension accounts, look at the spread that the banks are making on a stable currency now, and ask themselves, one, do we still think that is something that we should even continue with? And two, should we, the people, be either looking for relief or if not, be taking something? But either way, Mr. Speaker, whether the money goes toward the education fund or not, it's still an issue where the bank is still making 3.2% spread on a currency that is stable. That needs to be looked at. So I do understand where the government is coming from, because the last thing is that they need to maintain certain relationships, and I have no issues with that. I can very much understand that. Because if I was a banker and I heard the Premier said it, it automatically becomes policy. And I can understand the situation of not putting himself into that position. This is the last motion before this House closes, and I can say that this being my first budget process, there were some concerns, but at the end of the day, I think every member of this House, to some extent, and in most cases, did their job and did what they were supposed to do. I've said before that there are certain things in this country we shouldn't play politics with. Education, healthcare, the finance of the country, which include the financial services and tourism. And I think that in itself has been demonstrated in this House. I thank the government for accepting the two motions. And the truth of the fact is, Mr. Speaker, is I knew they weren't going to take the third. But nonetheless, I had to put it out there for them to consider it now, because at the end of the day, the reason why is that it's one thing to put an idea out there, it's the next thing to say, oh, you're going to pay for your idea. And the last thing I didn't want anyone to say was that I gave them something to consider, but not a way to pay for it. And I think the way in which I propose is still the right way to pay for it, because the people are being ripped off on that foreign exchange rate. And if we're going to be ripped off, we might as well take some from it. Or worst case, we can go look at the dormant pension accounts and see how much money we can get from that and see the education fund. But the thing about it is, Mr. Speaker, there's too much money floating around this country for the entire burden to be on the government of this country. It is unsustainable. And as the Premier said, God forbid we have one financial crisis. That'll be it for us. So this is about part of start looking at long-term planning for the country, Mr. Speaker. And once again, I thank the Premier and the Deputy Premier and everyone who spoke for their support, and also the fact that they're willing to establish the fund and also look at giving businesses the option. Now, I wish they would have taken the third, but again, I do understand the limitations in which they work with. So I just want to say thanks to everyone for that. Huh? Sorry.
The chair intends to put each resolved section separately. The question now is, the first resolved, be therefore resolved that the government considers establishing an education fund to assist with the development and advancement of education in the Cayman Islands. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those against, the ayes have it. That resolved section is duly passed. Second resolve section, and be it further resolved that the government considers funding this education fund with 50% of the foreign exchange spread earned by banks transacting between the Cayman Islands dollar and the United States dollar. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those against?
No.
No.
The noes have it.
Division, please.
Clerk.
Don't hide behind them sounds.
I heard 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 noes.
6 on?
6 ayes.
Yeah. You shut your phone off. Shut your mic off. You let me
Honorable Alden McLaughlin.
No.
Honorable Moses Colonel.
No.
Honorable Juliana Connolly.
No.
Honorable Dwayne Seymour.
No.
Honorable Roy McTaggart.
No.
Honorable Joseph Hugh. Honorable Tara Rivers. Honorable Bernie Bush. Captain Eugene Ebanks.
No.
Ms. Barbara Connolly.
No.
Mr. David White.
No.
Mr. Austin Harris.
No.
Honorable Honorable Ezra Miller.
Yes.
Mr. Alva Saku.
Aye.
Mr. Kenneth Bryan.
Aye.
Mr. Anthony Eden.
Aye.
Mr. Christopher Saunders.
Yes.
Mr. Ord McLean.
Aye.
The results of the division: noes 10, ayes 6, noes 10, 2 absentees. The resolve section is therefore negatived. The second resolve section is therefore negative. The question is, and be it further resolved that the government considers funding this education fund by giving companies the option of paying into the education fund an equivalent amount as per their approved business staffing plan. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those against? The ayes have it. This resolve section, the last resolve section, is duly passed. Was there anything else here? That's it. That's it. Before we take the vote for the adjournment, leave has been given to the member from Georgetown Central to raise a brief public matter. I now call on that member for Georgetown Central.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to, first before I say what I have to say, I want to say I appreciate the privilege to do so. I just want this Honourable House to join with me in congratulations to a 21-year-old young Caymanian male who has won the World Championship in the Amateur Stock Class Pro and Watercross in Florida. His name is Vanjie Ramjeed. He's the son of Vincent and Tanya Ramjeed, and I think it's important that we take opportunities when young Caymanians do so well overseas, and I want this Honourable House to join hands with me just by a symbol of a little tap on the table to congratulate him and his efforts in making Cayman proud.
The member for Georgetown West.
Mr. Speaker, I also, as councillor and on behalf of the Minister of Sports and the government, I would like to take the opportunity to publicly congratulate a young Caymanian, Mr. Vanji Ramjeet, on winning the Pro Watercross Amateur Box Stock World Championship on November the 3rd, 2017. We are extremely proud of him and his many achievements, and we all wish for him the very best as he continues to excel in his chosen sport. I had mentioned it earlier in this honorable house, and I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing me to publicly recognize Mr. Ramjeet. Thank you.
The Honorable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we have reached the end of this budget meeting. I do believe it is a record in terms of how much work we have gotten through in the period of time that we have since the budget was delivered on the 27th. I want to thank all members for being so willing to work late and for their cooperation. Generally, I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, for what I know were very long days during the budget debate, and I especially want to thank the Minister of Finance, who so ably chaired his first meeting of Finance Committee, working late into the evening. There were relatively few of the inevitable squabbles, a clear indication that he did a very good job as chairman. Yes, I want to thank, Mr. Speaker, my entire team for their hard work in the preparation of the budget and taking us through until now as well. And I want to thank the clerk and her staff in the legislature for the tremendous amount of support and hard work that they have done and service they've given us and the country. And so, Mr. Speaker, with those few words, I want to take the opportunity to wish all members well for the upcoming I want to take the opportunity to wish all members well for the upcoming holiday season, and to say this will be one of the first Christmas periods where the House has not actually been sitting. Mr. Speaker, the Minister for Financial Services and myself, along with various support staff, will be leaving next week, Friday, for London for the Joint Ministerial Council meeting and for various other engagements as we continue to deal with the challenging issue of the imminent list of publication of the imminent list of non-cooperative jurisdictions by the European Union. We've done a tremendous amount of work. We have a tremendous amount of more work to get done. I thank all members. I want to thank all members for their support. I was deeply moved the other evening when the Leader of the Opposition and the member for Bordentown West in particular indicated their support, as did other members, for the efforts of the government and the stance that the government is taking with respect to this issue. That was one of the very special moments for me in this House, a clear indication that when it comes to matters of major national importance, all members of this House are prepared to stand together to resist these threats, existential threats to our industry and indeed to these islands. Mr. Speaker, I also want to advise all members that the NICE program, as it's been called, the Christmas cleanup, has now been formalized, and The registration will begin on the 28th of November. There'll be public announcements about it. It'll be at the Lion Center as usual, and the program itself will start on the 4th of December. It will run for 2 weeks before Christmas, and then resume on the 8th of January. So the objective being that those who participate would get paid on the 19th of December, have some money for Christmas, and then have another week of work following Christmas so they can help get themselves through the inevitable aftermath of Christmas expenditure that all of us have to deal with. But there'll be public notifications about this, but I just thought I would let all members of the House know. And so Mr. Speaker, with that, I move the adjournment of this Honorable House sine die.
Question is that this Honorable Assembly do now stand adjourned, sine die. All in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Ayes have it.